My name's Steve. I'm the owner of Maull Biomedical Training. We teach contrast injectors, and welcome. All right. One of the things what we're going to go over today is really how simple the concept of contrast injectors are. I often tell my students before class, if you've seen one, you've seen them all. They're like defibrillators and infusion pumps in the sense that they all do the same thing the same way for the most part. Each model will have its own little bell or whistle feature that's kind of unique to it, but for the most part, if you know how to operate one, you know how to operate all of them. There's really nothing. It's just a pump. It is a high-end pump. It's a piston pump, a high-end piston pump, but at the end of the day, it's just a pump. I don't care how much you dress it up. I don't care what piece of medical equipment you connect it to. It's a pump. So yeah, what we're going to talk about today is just the basic operation of pretty much all contrast injectors. Now, what I have here is the most common contrast injector is the Stellant. It's the most common CT injector, but it's by far, there's probably more Stellant CT injectors on the planet than any other kind of contrast injector in the world. So before we get started though, no biomed experience, imaging and your military, so you're familiar. Imaging or biomed or both? Biomed. All right. So before we get rolling on this one, just real quick, so everybody's on the same page. All right. When it comes to imaging, we're going to take an X-ray of a patient. All right. So we have the patient on the table, and then the X-ray tube is above the patient, and then the image receiving device, which used to be film, but now it's CR or DR plates. It's some electronic plate that digitally captures the image, is going to be underneath or inside the table. Okay. So patient's on the table, X-rays come out of the X-ray tube and they go into the patient. Now, some of the X-rays that go into the patient are going to get absorbed by the patient, and some of the X-rays that go into the patient are going to pass through the patient, penetrate the patient. We need both things to happen, okay? Because X-rays, when they strike that plate, the X-rays that strike that plate make that plate turn dark. So we'll assume that that plate is going to start off as a clear blank image, or a white image, all right? As X-rays strike that plate starts to turn dark, okay? And the more X-rays that hit it, the darker those areas become, okay? So that plate is underneath the patient. So if the X-rays coming out of the X-ray tube go into the patient, if all the X-rays were absorbed by the patient, that means no X-rays actually hit the plate and we just get a white image. If all the X-rays pass through the patient and strike the plate, then the entire plate is now black, all right? So we need to have both penetration and absorption by the patient, okay? Now, the odds that an X-ray photon will go into a patient and be absorbed by the patient is dependent upon two things: the thickness and the density of the body part that X-ray photon is going to come in contact with. The thicker and denser the body part, the more likely that X-ray photon is to be absorbed by the patient and not pass through and strike that plate and make that area dark, okay? So bone, for instance, compared to soft tissue, is thicker and denser. So X-ray photons that strike bone tend to get absorbed by the patient. X-ray photons that don't strike bone pass through soft tissue of the patient. They tend to penetrate and hit the plate. So that's why your typical X-ray image is a dark background, and then the white areas of the bone show up because the bone blocked the X-rays from striking that plate, making that image, that part of the image, darker, okay? So that's the basics of how an X-ray image is produced. Now, blood vessels are neither thick nor dense. X-ray photons have no trouble passing through a blood vessel, okay? So blood vessels don't typically show up on a typical X-ray image, which most of the time is fine. Most of the time when the patient's getting an X-ray done, I'm not looking for blood vessels, I'm looking for broken bones. But sometimes that is the case. Sometimes I do want to take patients or take an image of a patient and I'm looking for the blood vessels. I need to see the veins and the arteries. So since veins and arteries don't absorb X-rays and don't show up on X-ray images, what we have to do is we have to inject something into the patient during the actual procedure that will block X-rays and make those blood vessels show up on the X-ray image. And that's what this is, all right? The fluid in this one. The fluid in this syringe is called contrast. Contrast blocks X-rays, and I'll talk about that in a little bit more detail here in just a few minutes. But so yeah, during the actual X-ray image, whether it's an MRI scan or a CT scan or an angiographic procedure, we're going to fire the fluid into the patient while the X-rays are passing into the patient, and then that will cause those blood vessels to show up on the images. Now, what I've just described to you is referred to as angiography. Angio means blood. Ography is the viewing of. All right, so angiography is literally the viewing of blood vessels whenever you hear that term. And that's what this is. Angiography, and this is a good example. This is actually the opposite example of what I was talking about. This one is a fluoroscopic image, not a radiographic image. I won't get into what that all is, but white background where the images of the body parts we're looking for are dark. It's the same thing, just flipped. But angiography is a procedure. Does this have a? Oh yeah, it does. Okay. Angiography is a procedure performed to view blood vessels after injecting them with the radiopaque dye or the contrast fluid that outlines them on the X-ray image that makes the viewing of these blood vessels even possible. And this is incredibly effective. The fluid in the contrast is incredibly effective at blocking X-rays. I mean, you'll see this is actually a brain scan, and you'll see how hair thin some of these blood vessels are. And just the microscopic quantities of contrast in those blood vessels still are enough to let them show up on an X-ray image. So yeah, this contrast, when I say it blocks X-rays, it does it outstanding. Now, when it comes to contrast injectors, there's 3 types, okay? There's 15 different models that are used here in the US, 9 or 10. I'd say 8 or 9 or make up the vast majority of the contrast injectors. But every contrast injector can be broken down into one of 3 types. There are, oh, wrong button. There's CT, or I'm sorry, angio, catheter angio. This is used in your typical X-ray rooms. This is your cardiac and cath labs and things like that, special procedures rooms. And then there's CT injectors, and then there are MRI injectors. Now, the 3 different types, they had to come up with 3 different types because each one does, each type of procedure, an angiographic procedure and a CT procedure, an MRI procedure, they're slightly different animals. So the machine that we need to fire fluid in the patient to make these blood vessels show up has to be slightly different from each other. The operation's basically the same, but the gist of the machine is going to be slightly different. Each of the systems, those 3 types, each of the systems uses the contrast injector to inject the fluid into the patient to improve, or in some cases, make it all possible to view the images of the blood vessels. These images that are produced are referred to as angiograms or angiographs. Now, CT and MRI. So this is a CT injector. This is the CT injector. This is the Cadillac of contrast injectors. So this is a CT injector, and then MRI injectors. Oh, I keep hitting the wrong button. These 2 types of injectors, the fluid is injected into the patient via an IV needle. The 3rd type of contrast injector that I mentioned, the angiographic contrast injectors, that is done with a catheter. Now, angiographic procedures, those are where we're actually going to shoot fluid into a specific body part, like the brain or a chamber of the heart, okay? So for angiographic procedures, they'll actually take a catheter, and a catheter is a very long, very thin tube, and that is inserted through typically the femoral or the femoral vein or the femoral artery, and they'll snake the tip of that catheter up into, via the vein or artery we've inserted into, they'll snake it up into the brain. They can snake it into the left or right atrium or the left or right ventricle of the heart, things like that, and then inject the fluid into that particular body part the instant we're taking this particular shot. Now, for CT and MRI procedures, has everybody in here had a CT procedure done? An MRI procedure? All right. Compared to an angiographic procedure, think of an angiographic procedure as a snapshot. All right, I'm going to take an image of this. All right, see, angiographic procedures are very short shots. I mean, literally milliseconds. Okay, it's bang and it's over. Hold your breath. Boom. Go ahead. That I do not know. There aren't contrast injectors for nuke med, because nuke med, they're not actually injecting a fluid into the patient. They're injecting radioactive isotopes into the patient. So like typical X-ray, the X-ray tube creates the radiation. In nuke med, we make the patient radioactive. And then we place a receptor, a camera, a nuke med camera over the patient. And then as the patient is emitting radiation, this camera is picking it up, and that's how that's produced. There's no contrast injectors for nuke med. All right. Now for MRI and CT procedures compared to angio, MRI and CT procedures are relatively long shots. All right. If you go in for a CT, it's not like, hold your breath, beep, and it's over. For CT, as you guys probably know, the patient's on the table. The table gets moved into the CT gantry, and then the X-ray tube is spinning around the patient as the patient is slowly fed into it. So this is nowadays CT procedures, they range anywhere from 30 seconds to a couple of minutes. All right, MRI procedures are even longer. But MRI procedures, 20 minutes, 30, 40 minutes or so, depending on the body part and the T level, the magnetic level of the MRI system. So long story short, again, angiographic images are very quick images. CT and MRI procedures are very long. So for CT and MRI procedures, we don't use a catheter to get the fluid into the patient. It's just an IV needle in the patient's arm or the back of their hand. And basically, we're going to fill the patient up with this contrast fluid, just get it in their bloodstream. And then once that's in their bloodstream, then we'll start scanning the patient with the CT or MRI. So more on that in just a little bit. The contrast is later just eliminated through the blood vessels, from the blood vessels through the typical kidney and liver functions. Now, here in the United States, there are 3 dogs in this fight, and there's an absolute pecking order amongst the 3. Gotta edit that. Bayer Medrad is by far the biggest manufacturer of contrast injectors here, in the whole world, but especially here in the United States. By far the #1. Their main injectors for angio are the Mark 7 of the Provis. They have the Stellant, like this one is their main CT injector. And then their 2 MRI injectors are the MR Experian and the Spectra Solaris. The second company, #2, way behind, but definite #2, is they start off as Levoflorsheim, then became Mallinckrodt, then they got big Covidien, then became Tyco. I don't know if there's, I mean, I don't know if anybody's, what time is it? Someone might have bought them out again by now. But their main injectors are the OptiVantage, the Angiometaluma for angio, and then the OptiStar. The OptiStar is pretty rare, not a whole lot of those out there, but that's their main MRI injector. And then third, but coming on strong, is Bracco EZM. They've been around a long time, but I get, people contact me about doing contrast injector training, and up until a year ago, I would get maybe a handful of calls a year about Bracco and EZM injectors, the ACES CVI and the Empower CT systems. Literally, I could count on one hand the number of people that would contact me in an entire year. Now I get that many calls a month, without exaggerating. I mean, Bracco has really stepped up their game as far as getting their contrast injectors out in the market, and they are making serious headway. Their ACES CVI and their Empower CTA are really cracking into Bayer Medrad's market share here in the U.S. So to tell you what they're doing, they're actually just giving the hospital the injector, and then they have to sign a contract that they have to buy their contrast fluids and syringes from them. So that's how they do it. There's a lot of clinical lab companies. In the clinical lab, there's a lot of clinical lab companies that do that. We'll just give you the hematology analyzer. You just have to sign a service contract and buy your reagents from us, and so, yep. All right. Yes, it does. All right. Now the intravenous contrast, it highlights the blood vessels and enhances the structure of the areas. As you can see, this right here, this is an image of the heart. You can see the heart in the background, but this large, very bright, very large vessel coming out here, that's the aorta. And you can see how incredibly effective it is. I mean, this image was obviously taken with the aorta completely filled with contrast, and you can barely make out the heart in the background because it's a bit darker. So obviously the X-rays pass through it, and the heart is much bigger and thicker and denser than this blood vessel right here. But at this particular moment, there was very little contrast in the heart and a lot in the aorta. So the aorta shows up very, very brightly. Once it's injected into the bloodstream, it circulates throughout the body. And that's one thing that it doesn't really affect us as BMETs. I mean, it's nothing we have to worry about, but just be aware of that. If I inject, if I want to look at this chamber of the heart, okay, so I fill this chamber of the heart with contrast. This is a living patient. That contrast will be there literally 1 second, because as soon as the heart beats, it moves. Heart beats again, it moves again. So they're literally chasing this contrast through the patient's system. So the timing for angiographic procedures, not CT and MRI, but for the timing of angiographic procedures to get the contrast in the region of interest and get the shot at the same time It's not difficult, but it is critical. They need to be done together at the same time, simultaneously. The beam passing through the patient in the case of X-ray and CT, or the RF energy released from the patient in the case of MRI, is weakened. The anatomical structures are enhanced by this process and show up as lighter areas on the image. Okay. Any questions so far? Everybody cool with it? All right. Sir, I'm sorry. Are you familiar at all with contrast? Okay. So basically, one thing I just want to point out: the contrast fluid, which is in this syringe right here, contrast blocks X-rays. Long story short. So that's how these images, when we fill the blood vessels up with this contrast fluid, the X-rays don't penetrate the patient, leaving those areas on the image brighter. Okay. So that's the gist of how these work. Yep. All right. Now, for X-ray and CT injectors, for angio and CT injectors, now those are both X-ray systems, all right? They're different kinds of X-ray systems, but they both use X-rays to produce the images. The main ingredient in this syringe is iodine. It's not the red iodine that your mom put on your scraped knees and stuff like that. It's iodine. I was actually a BMet when I found out, oh, I thought iodine was red. Nope, they put that in there. But yeah, the main ingredient in contrast fluid for angio and CT injectors is iodine. Without getting into the science of it, and it's because of the number of electrons in an iodine atom. But iodine blocks X-rays. It's just really, really, really good at it. So you put iodine into the patient, those X-rays will not pass through that particular body part. Okay. Now for MRI, MRI does not use X-rays to produce the image. MRI, is anybody here MRI experts? All right, so I can say anything. All right. Now, MRI, I can make it up. MRI uses a magnetic field and electronic pulses, RF pulses. Okay. So let's say it's a knee. A lot of people get MRIs on torn ACLs and stuff like that around the knee. They'll actually put a I'm drawing a blank. What's it called? There's a name for it, I can't remember. They'll put a thing around the patient's knee, all right? And this this thing is actually an image receptor, okay? So the reason we put the patient into this magnetic field, so for MRI, a typical MRI is 3T, all right, 3 Tesla, all right, which is 30,000, am I doing my math right? 30,000 times the Earth's magnetic pole. Okay, the magnetic pole that makes a compass do its thing, all right, that is 1 Gauss. And I think, if I recall, 1 Gauss is 10,000 T. Okay, so an incredibly powerful magnet. Now, the reason we're doing this, all right, the body is made up of roughly 70% water. Water is H2O, 2 parts hydrogen, 1 part oxygen. You go back to your high school science. Hydrogen is the first atom in the periodic chart. Hydrogen has 1 electron in its orbital shell. All right, so if you remember your atom, there's the nucleus, and in the nucleus there's protons and neutrons, and in the orbiting shell there are electrons. All right, hydrogen has 1 electron. Now, if we take this patient and we slide them into this incredibly intense magnetic field, that electron is going to get polarized as it's doing its orbit around the nucleus of that atom. As it's grabbed by the power of that magnetic field, that electron will either get trapped in the North Pole or trapped in the South Pole, depending on where it is when it's grabbed, okay? And literally there's hundreds of trillions of these atoms in your body, all right? Now, so this atom is sitting here with the electron sitting up here, polarized, all right? Now what we're gonna do is, the MRI system, this, oh, I can't believe I can't remember the name of this stupid thing. Anyway, coils, thank you. Yes, coil, yes. This coil is going to inject pulses into that patient's body part, we'll say the knee, all right? As that RF pulse, and there's literally thousands of these pulses done per second, as that RF pulse is pulsed into the patient, that electron is going to recess off its axis, all right? Think of it as pulling the bow on an arrow, or a bow, the line on a bow, all right? So that electron is going to recess off its axis. When that RF pulse is taken away, that electron precesses back to its axis. Now, when it precesses back to its axis, that's like letting go of the bowstring. It's going to release an RF pulse back, and that coil picks up that echo, All right, we're literally going to do this hundreds of millions of times to hundreds of trillions of atoms for the next 20, 30, or 40 minutes. All right, so all those little RF pulses that get sent back are picked up by the coil, and in 20 or 30 minutes, that's the images that we will get. Okay, now how the contrast works. The stronger, so this atom, as we recess it off its axis, the further it recesses off, the harder the snap back we're going to get. So a stronger RF pulse will come out. Stronger RF pulse means darker areas of the image. All right. What gadolinium does, remember, this is an MR injector, so it's not iodine, it's gadolinium. What gadolinium does is, and I have no idea how it does this, but it basically dampens the effect of those RF pulses on those electrons. So now there's gadolinium contrast in the region of interest. When that RF pulse is applied, that electron does not recess off its axis as much. So when the RF pulse is removed and it precesses back, there's a very faint image that goes back. So that is how gadolinium creates lighter areas in the image in the region of interest versus how iodine does it with X-ray. All right, believe it or not, totally up to you. That's what I was told anyway. That's what I was told. Oh yeah, I've worked on that story. Yes. No, I didn't just make that up off the fly. I've been. Yes. All right. Now I'm going to get into something else. This is an important concept. It's an easy concept to understand, but it's kind of it needs a little bit of explanation. Whenever the operators set the injector up and we're ready to shoot, there's 3 parameters that they have to choose on the display. All right, they have to select flow rate, which is the speed of the injection. All right, how fast are we going to fire this fluid into the patient? The second thing they have to pick up, they have to determine is the volume. How much fluid are we going to fire into the patient? And then the third thing they have to select on the monitor is something called pressure limit. All right, now the first 2, flow rate and volume. We're all experienced BMETs. I think everybody understands flow rate and volume. All right, even a non-BMET, flow rate and volume. Okay. Now the pressure limit. Basically, what the pressure limit is we're going to tell the system, all right, the typical pressure limit for a CT injector is 300 psi. And what that means is we're telling the system, do not exceed 300 psi in the syringe. Now that's the important thing. That is not the pressure that gets to the patient. Okay, that is the maximum pressure we will allow in the syringe during the actual injection. And it's not a goal. Okay, it's not the goal. If I set a flow rate of 5 and a volume of 50 and a pressure limit of 300 psi, I want a flow rate of 5 milliliters per second. I want a volume of 50 milliliters, but I'm just saying don't exceed 300 psi. If we don't get to 300 psi, the injection is not a failure. That's the pressure limit is just a safety precaution. Say don't exceed this. We might only get 20, 50, 70 psi. That's fine. Just don't go over 300. Okay. Now the main things that control the pressure in the syringe during an actual injection, the primary determinant of how much pressure gets built up in the syringe is the speed of the injection, the flow rate. All right. If you imagine this is a 200 milliliter syringe. All right. And let's say I'm doing an injection at 1 milliliter per second. So how this typically works, I'm jumping ahead of myself just slightly here, but there's connector tubing here, all right? Thin connector tubing. And that one goes there. This one goes here. So we've set up this injection, and this actually goes to the patient, to the IV needle. So that's how everything's set up. So this is a 200 milliliter syringe. Let's say I'm shooting 1 milliliter per second flow rate, which is a very slow flow rate. All right. So 1 milliliter per second, I'm slowly pushing this fluid out this little tiny hole at the top of the syringe, and it's going through this long, thin connector tubing, and then through the very thin IV needle. But it's only 1 milliliter per second. I mean, it's barely a trickle. There's not a whole lot of pressure built up in the syringe during the actual injection. All right. Now, we can't do it, but let's say I could go up to 200 milliliters per second. Let's say I could shove all this fluid out of this syringe in 1 second through that tiny little hole, through this long tube, and then through the IV needle. That would be an incredible amount of pressure built up in this syringe during the actual injection. So the primary determinant of how much pressure gets built up in the syringe during the injection is the speed of the injection, the flow rate. There's other little things that do also affect how much pressure gets built up. the viscosity of the fluid. Contrast, there's a little bit of a syrupy texture to it. It's clear. It is very thin, but it's not as thin as water. There is a slight syrupy texture to it. And you have to remember, we're eventually shoving this fluid through an IV needle, which is incredibly thin. So try to shove maple syrup through an IV needle, that would take a lot of force. That would create a lot of pressure. So one of the things is the viscosity of the fluid. The thicker the fluid, the more pressure will get built up. The thinner the connector tubing and the longer the connector tubing, the more pressure. The smaller the IV needle, obviously, the greater the pressure. But like I said before, the one thing that is the primary determinant of how much pressure is the speed of the injection. Okay, so we've set up our protocol: flow rate, volume, pressure limit. Okay, so we're telling the machine don't exceed 300 psi during the actual injection because it might rupture the syringe. We don't want the syringe to rupture. Now, like I said before, that 300 psi, that does not get to the patient. All right. Any of the BMEDs, you guys ever worked on infusion pumps? All right. What's the alarm? At what pressure? What psi does a typical? And you don't have to be exact, but ballpark. What's the maximum pressure we will allow an infusion pump to get to before we shut it off? We start alarming and we get the nurse's attention. Everybody recall? Yeah, I was gonna say it's like 10 to 20 psi. All right. This is 300 psi. The angio injector versions of these that I mentioned earlier, they'll go up to 1,000 or 1,200 psi. No, that is not. We're not putting 1,000 psi into the patient. Infusion pumps freak out if you get over 10. All right. No, so it's not 300. How this works, and it's just the fluid. You have to just remember your fluid dynamics training. When we go from this 1.5 inch wide bore to this 2 millimeter wide bore up here, that's where we get the dramatic decrease in pressure. I mean, in here, it's 300 psi. Right here, we're down into the single digits. All right, and the closer we get to the opening is lower and lower. By the time we get the pressure, the fluid to the patient, we're in the low single digit psi's. All right, so that 300 psi or 1,000, 1,200 psi, that's not in the patient. And that's partly what the purpose of what I'm talking about here is. All right, so let's say we've set up a shot. All right, our pressure limit, our flow rate and our volume, we've set a pressure limit of 200 psi. All right, and we're doing the shot, and it just so happens we hit that maximum pressure. The machine senses, there's circuitry in here that actually senses it calculates the pressure in the injector, in the syringe. Let's say we do hit that pressure limit. All right, unlike an infusion pump, when an infusion pump hits its pressure limit, it stops. All right, stops infusing. That's not the case with contrast injectors. If a contrast injector hits its maximum pressure, we don't want to stop the injection. Why wouldn't we stop the injection? Anybody guess? No reason for you to know. Nope. Good guess. Patient's already here. Other than this fluid right here, what else are we firing into the patient at this exact moment? X-rays. All right. If we stop the injection, all the radiation we just fired into the patient was for nothing. We have to start over. We have to do it again. All right. So what the machine does is, if we hit our pressure limit, they don't stop the injection. So they don't stop the injection from keeping the pressure creeping up and up and up and up. But what do? They just slow the injection down. They back the flow rate off. All right. Now, hopefully, most of the time, to be honest, if that does occur, we're still fine. We'll still get the image that we need. All right. I mean, if the injection stops, we definitely have to do this again. If we just slow the flow rate down, we might have to do it again. But most of the time, I mean, we're still getting fluid flow to the region of interest. It's most likely the image is going to be good. If that occurs, 99 times out of 100, it's operator error. These systems are set up to be able to shoot the protocols at the pressure limits the system has been set up to. For whatever reason, and I don't know the answer to this, I've been teaching this exact model for 14 years now. The syringes are rated at 400 psi. The catheters are rated at in excess of 400 psi. IV needles are rated at over 1,000 psi. Okay, there's no reason for the operator to select anything other than the maximum pressure limits this contrast injector is capable of, which is in this case, it's 325. Most CT injectors go to 300, but this particular model goes 325. No idea why. But I do not know the scenario where they're like, we got to lower this pressure limit. No, everything in the system, the syringe, the connector tube, the IV needles, they can handle 325 PSI. There's no reason that I know of for them to lower the pressure limit to something other than the maximum. And most of the time when you guys get pressure limits is because they did that. They lowered it down to 100 PSI. They're like, oh man, 300 PSI. Man, that's an awful lot in the left atrium. All right, go 100 PSI. Like the left atrium can handle 100 PSI. So yeah, most of the time when you get that, it's a deal with you made your pressure limit too low. Put your pressure limit back up to the maximum, and you'll be able to shoot your shot. Yeah. No, remember the it's the same thing. And if it's just research, then why put it on every single injector out there? Just make a special one for the VA or whatever. Yeah, I don't know. I really don't. But anyway, so that's what happens, right? So if the injection hits its maximum pressure, it just backs off the flow rate a little bit, all right, and then continues with the injection. Now, most of them, not every single model, but most of the models, there will be some audible on it. There'll be some tone that will sound alerting them that the injector has hit its pressure limit. But if the injection is still going, they'll typically just roll it. All right. All right. Now, to be honest, I've explained a lot through a bunch of these slides that are already just sort of not skipped past, but talked about them before they got up. Pressure limiting protects the syringe from bursting during the injection by limiting the amount of pressure that can be placed on it during the injection. It does it by reducing the flow rate in case we hit the pressure limit. Things that affect the pressure limit, this is what I mentioned earlier. Like I said, by far, the flow rate is the one that affects it the most. And then also the thickness of the liquid. The thicker the liquid is, the more syrupy it is, the more difficult it is to shoot it through small vessels. So we try to keep the contrast fluid warm, because what happens when you warm syrup up, it gets runnier. Okay, so there's heaters that they can put on these syringes. Pretty much every injector does this. They'll keep the contrast in a warmer, and then they'll fill the syringe up prior to the patient showing up. And then when the patient shows up, they'll take it out of the warmer, put it on there and shoot right away. And then they'll also have warmers that they just wrap around the syringes that also help keep the contrast warm. Now, if they can't take a syringe of room temperature contrast and put a warmer on it and heat it up, but if it's already up to temperature, which is the temperature they keep it at is body temperature, 98 degrees Fahrenheit, 37 degrees Celsius. If they put a warmer on already warmed up contrast, it will help keep it there longer. Okay. Yeah. All right. Flow rate, viscosity of the fluid, and the length and diameter of the catheter tubing. Any questions so far? All right. Now, every contrast injector, and there's actually a couple exceptions over the years I found, but for the most part, most contrast injectors, there's three components to the contrast injector. There's the head, there's the display, and then the other one's down here on the floor. You guys can't see it, the power supply. All right. Pretty much every contrast injector in the world, those are the three components. None of them have two, none of them have four: head, display, main unit. You can count on those three things. Now, some systems have combined the display and the power supply, but that's kind of rare. The syringes, what do I say here? Some hold one syringe filled with contrast, some hold two syringes. Now, angio injectors, just one syringe. The angio injector, where I was talking about special procedures, cath labs, they don't use saline in those procedures. It's just the nature of the beast. They don't need the saline for enhancing the images. But CT and MRI injectors do often and you almost say always use a saline syringe. MRIs, all MRI systems use saline. Most, and when I say most, like 99% of CT injectors use saline. There are single head CT injectors, but they're pretty rare. And with modern CT systems now being 64 slice and 128 slice and stuff, I mean, you would not put a single head. The single head means just contrast syringe, no saline syringe. You would not put a single head syringe on a multi-slice CT injector. You lose the ability of that MRI or that CT injector to perform some of the images without the saline during the shot. So the vast majority of CT injectors, you can't say all of them, but almost all of them use contrast and saline syringes. And another thing too, salines, there's just a couple exceptions to this rule, but for the most part, the syringes are model specific. These syringes go on the Stellant and only the Stellant. They don't fit on any other model. And that is true on almost every other model. The only exceptions I can think of is the Mark V Plus and the Provis, but the Provis was the replacement for the Mark V Plus, so they didn't change syringes when they upgraded their machines. And then Liebel Florsheim makes two different syringes or two different models of injectors, but they use the same exact syringe. But other than that, every other model out there has a syringe unique to just it. The syringe heaters, I mentioned that earlier. The heaters, they all look basically like this, and they all do that, and then they'll plug in somewhere in the back of the injector. And again, that heater is just there to keep the contrast and saline warm. Now, one of the things I mentioned earlier was that we keep the contrast warm because there is a slight syrupy texture to it. If they're attaching a heater to the contrast, they're most likely also going to attach one to the saline, because sometimes they'll, and I'm going to talk about this here in a minute, they'll shoot contrast and then they'll shoot saline to follow it, and then one after the other. Some versions of the Stellant, some software versions of the Stellant have what's called a cardiac package, where it'll actually shoot both syringes at the same time. They can select, give me 60% contrast, 40% saline. So it doesn't really do any good to have contrast warmed up and then saline at room temperature, because as soon as you mix them, then there was no point in warming the contrast up. So oftentimes, most of the time, if they're heating the contrast up, they're also heating the saline up, especially if they're shooting simultaneous shots. And another little fun fact, does anybody have, I know you guys said you're not a whole lot of experience with this. Guess how much this costs? This little piece of plastic, there's just a little resistor in here. The current makes these little things here. $150? Nope. Nope. Nope, higher. More than $999. $1,300. $1,300 for this, and you can't fix it. What's that? Yeah, you can't fix them. I mean, if there's one component in here, and I don't know what makes it go bad, just time, I guess. But when it dies, this little light right here goes red. You have to toss it out. You can't repair it. You just have to buy a new one. $1,300. Yeah. Whew. Oh yeah. And this is what I mentioned earlier. Whenever you're doing an injection, this ends at 3:30. Okay. Yeah. Whenever they're performing an injection, there are three parameters to the protocol that they have to select: flow rate, volume, and pressure limit. Now, there's other things they can select, and I'll talk about those here in a second. But everything else can be left blank. All right. Delays, pauses, and stuff like that. Those fields can be left blank. But these three, there has to be something in those fields for us to perform the injection. Let's see here. Yep, the selected flow rate is sets the rate at which the fluid is going to be injected. It says typically in milliliters per second. It's always in milliliters per second. Some injectors will go to minutes or milliliters per minute. There's one model that goes to milliliters per hour. I have no idea why, but it's always milliliters per second. Volume sets the total amount of contrast we're going to shoot into the patient, and then the pressure limit I just beat to death. And it'll be anywhere. Your typical pressure limits will be anywhere from 50 to 1200 psi settings, but they should never select a pressure limit of 50. How do they know? All right, so for CT and MRI injectors, it's as a matter of fact, MRI injectors, a lot of them, it's just factory set at 300 psi. The operators cannot change the pressure limit. CT injectors, I mentioned that earlier. I have no idea why they give them the ability. It should be set at 300 psi and just left alone. There's no reason to ever lower it. Angio injectors, on the other hand, okay, because those are just going to CT and MRI injectors. They're just going into an IV needle. Angio injectors, though, all right, angio injectors can go up to 1,000 or 1,200 psi. Now, for angio injectors, I mentioned earlier, they don't use IV needles. They use catheters, and that catheter can either be inserted through the artery in the neck, or the femoral artery or the femoral vein in the thigh, and that the tip of that catheter can get guided into a particular body part. All right. Now, angio injectors, the operators will change the pressure limits for each shot. All right. They don't just set it 1,000 and leave it. Okay. Now, the component they use to determine what the pressure limit should be, what's the maximum pressure we should allow in the syringe, is actually not this, the catheter. Okay, that catheter that's inside the patient. Now, when that catheter comes in its package, there's going to be all sorts of information about that catheter. And one of the pieces of information on there is maximum allowable pressure. And it will be 750, 950, 1200, something like that. All right. That's the number for angio injectors. This is not for CT and MR, but for angio injectors, that's the number they'll put for their pressure limit selected. Because if you think about it, I'm getting a little advanced here. I mentioned earlier, let's say there's 300 PSI pressure built up in the syringe. There's 300 PSI in the syringe, but as soon as it gets here out to the thin tubing, we've dramatically dropped down, all right? That's if there is successful flow. If at the end of here, fluid is trickling out, what I said is true, okay? Maximum pressure here, minimum pressure once it gets out. If, for whatever reason, there's a kink or a blockage of this fluid line, all right, that is out the window, all right? Whatever pressure is in here is all the way up to that blockage. So there's 1,000 PSI here, there's 1,000 PSI up to this point, okay? So if you think about it, you have your syringe, you have your connector tubing, and you have your catheter that's inside the patient. Which of those three components, which of those three components would we least like to explode during the actual injection? The catheter. Oh, forget the patient. The catheter is expensive. Catheter is very expensive. No, we don't want the catheter to rupture. We cannot have the catheter. Worst case scenario, if all the stars align and we actually get 1,000 or 1,200 PSI to the catheter inside the patient, we cannot allow that catheter to rupture. So for angiographic procedures, they'll select their pressure limit based on what the catheter is rated at. Okay, because this, I mean, to be honest, I mean the connector tubings will pop off more than likely before we get to that kind of pressure outside the syringe. It'll hold here, but these are designed to break away from the T-box at like 400 PSI or something like that. So, because it's never intended to have that much pressure outside the syringe. So, yeah. But you never know. Hundreds of thousands of these done a day. There's always going to be one wild card. All right. Multiphase injections. Every injector on the planet calls them multiphase except one stupid one that calls it multi-level. It's exactly the same thing. This right here, this is a multiphase injection. Let me reset. All right. So that right there. All right. So this first line right here, it says A. All right, and it's green. That indicates my green syringe here, which in this case is contrast. All right, different models have slightly different color codes and stuff like that. But this first line here, that is the first phase. This is a single phase shot, one phase. We're going to shoot, and then this column here is flow rate. The next column is volume. So let me make this 5. No, don't do that. I'll do it this way. I'll make this 20. I'll make this 5. All right. So I'm going to shoot a flow rate of 5 milliliters per second and a volume of 20 milliliters. All right, and that's one shot. I'm going to arm my injector. I'll talk about that here in a second. I'm going to say, yep, I checked for air, even though it didn't. There's nothing but air in here, but it doesn't know that. Then I'm going to shoot the shot. All right, so my contrast syringe is moving forward at a rate of 5 milliliters per second. It's going to shoot 20 milliliters, and then the shot's over. All right, 4-second shot. All right, that was a single phase injection. Now, thank you. Let's say I want to shoot saline with it. All right, so I go over here. This is my second phase, and I select flush, a flow rate of 5, volume of say 30. Enter. Let's make it a flow rate of 10. Enter. Now that is a 2-phase injection. All right, first phase is contrast at a certain flow rate and volume. Second phase is saline at a different flow. Or it could be the same, but we're going to switch to a different fluid. I'm going to arm my injector. I already told it I checked for air. So now when I shoot this shot, First phase, contrast. When the contrast phase is done, it immediately goes to the next phase. So that's a two-phase injection, okay? Different models have different numbers of phases they can do. Some models can do 4 phases, some can do 6, some can do 8. Now, the reason you would want a multi-phase injection primarily is I just need to move to the different fluid, all right? I want to shoot contrast, I want to follow it with saline, and then sometimes they'll go back to contrast again. Another reason you might want to do a multi-phase injection, I want to start my contrast at 1 flow rate, and then I want to slow it down or speed it up. Okay, so I'm not changing fluids, I just need to change flow rate. So I'll shoot 1 milliliter per second for 3 seconds, and then I'll bump it up to like 5 milliliters for 100 milliliters or something like that. So that is a multi-phase or a multi-level, the Probus, the one angio injector on the planet. It refers to them as levels, but literally every other manufacturer model calls them phases. But that's why you would do a multi-phase injection. Holding a pause, if let's say, let's go back here, let's do another flush, 5, 20, enter, there we go. Wow, I can't believe let me do that. All right, this second phase here, so that's a 3-phase injection now. Let's take my second phase and make it a hold, okay? Basically what that means is if I shoot this shot, arm it, shoot it. All right, first phase is gonna shoot. Then when it's over, system goes into a hold. And there's multiple reasons why they might want to inject or insert a hold into one of the phases. Now what a hold is, it's a permanent stoppage of the injection until the operators are ready to go and they manually go to the next phase, all right? So that's a hold. Do your thing. Now a pause, people think, well, isn't that the same thing? No, there is a slight difference between the two. A pause is a stoppage of the injection, but for a specified period of time. So if I shoot this shot, arm it, contrast does its thing. We hit the second phase, a pause. It's a 3-second pause. Then without the operator doing anything, it automatically goes to the next one. So a pause is just a temporary stoppage of the injection, and it will move on to the next phase once our selected time period is over. A hold is and pauses are actually very rarely used. Most of the time, if they want to stop between phases, it'll be a hold. So they control when we start it back up. Subtle difference, but it is a difference. Delays. So the contrast injector, remember there's the contrast injector and there's the imaging system, whether it's angio, CT, or MRI. We don't always want the two of them to start at the same time, all right? Sometimes we do. I want the X-ray system or the imaging system to start doing its thing, and I want the injector to start doing its thing simultaneously, but sometimes they don't. As a matter of fact, most of the time they don't. I want one to start and then the other one to start so many seconds later. Both the imaging system and the contrast injector, typically modern imaging systems, have the ability to have programmed into them to have a scan or an X-ray delay for angio injectors or an inject delay. So a scan or X-ray delay means my injector is going to start injecting, and then so many seconds later, the imaging system starts doing its thing. Then the exact opposite of that. There's an inject delay is just that. The imaging system starts doing its thing, and then so many seconds later, the injector starts injecting. Now, the reason they program delays like that, there's 2 buttons. Remember, there's an X-ray exposure switch or a start MRI switch. I've never seen one of those. What's the start button on MRI look like? Does it say start? I don't know. There's a start image. There's a start imaging button. There's a button. And then my injector also has a start button, basically. All right. So it's easiest on the operators. All right. Let's say I wanted a 3-second inject delay. All right. So that means I hit. If there were no delays programmed, that means they have to hit the imaging switch. 1 Mississippi, 2 Mississippi, 3 Mississippi. Hit this switch. Okay. That's a 3-second delay. It's easier if I program an inject delay. That way I can hit both the exposure switch and the ejector switch at the same time. soon as I hit that, the imaging system goes, and then the system will count down 3 seconds more accurately than my 3 Mississippis, and then take off on its own. So that's the advantage of an inject delay or an imaging scan or X-ray delay. And another thing too, it's not uncommon at all that the injector is interfaced with the imaging system. They don't do it in MRI. No MRIs do it, but pretty much all CT and angio injectors do it. The imaging system or the injector can be interfaced with the imaging system. What that advantage gives us is now I just have to hit one button. You hit the exposure switch, it controls both. I don't have to hit both the imaging switch and the injector switch. No, it's not a serial port. Oh yeah, the Stellan does it. Yep. No, it's a connector. The wire goes into that one, and specifically for the MedRad injectors, there's a wire that comes out of the control box, and it's called ISI, Imaging System Interface. It's the ISI port, and it'll go to a little box, and the box is literally this big, and it's white. And there's 3 different boxes. I'm just getting into the specific of the Stellan. There's a 700 box, an 800 box, and a 900 box. And the box that you need is dependent upon the manufacturer of the imaging system. Like and these aren't real, but I'm making these up. But like GE needs the 700 box, Siemens needs the 800 box, and so forth. Yes, it is. Yep. Yep.
I was asking about the injection delay in my head. What was the purpose? Why is a 5-second injection delay recommended for the check? And that's what I was trying to figure out. I'm like, why?
Yep. Yep. Exactly. All right. Not every injector does this, but there is something called KVO, which means keep vein open. This is for CT and MRI injectors. Angio injectors don't do this. This is for CT and MRI because remember, CT and MRI use IV needles to perform the injections. Angio injectors use catheters. Catheters, to be honest, I don't know why this doesn't happen to catheters, but if you have an IV needle in your arm or wherever for an extended period of time without any fluid coming through it, the tip of the IV needle can actually start to form a blood clot at the very tip of it. So to keep that from happening, and it can actually block the vein. All right, now without an IV needle there, that doesn't happen, but with an IV needle there, that can happen. So what they can do is they can program what's called a KVO, keep vein open. What that does is it'll either have a very slow trickle of fluid out the IV needle constantly, like 0.1 milliliter per second constantly, or more common, it'll inject a quarter milliliter, a 0.25 milliliter drop of fluid and the operator would set up every 20 seconds, 30 seconds, 40 seconds, something like that. And that's called KVO, keep vein open. A test injection. This is angio injectors don't do this. They do it manually. They do test injections, but it's not set up in the protocols. But yeah, MRI and CT injectors like this one, they have what are called test injections because the patient comes in, we have an IV needle in the arm. We want to make sure before we go blasting 200 milliliters of contrast into that patient's arm that we actually hit the vein and we're not in soft tissue. So the very first phase, let me kill all that. All right, so the very first phase, I can select a test inject. And when I add test inject, it didn't replace that first phase, it just inserted a phase. And your test injection is obviously it's going to be a very slow injection, very low volume, all right? Because I just want to see if the arm starts bulging up because I'm filling the muscle or the skin with fluid instead of firing it into the vein. So obviously we're going to do a test injection on the first phase. There's no point in doing it second, third, or fourth phase. Those are not options. So that's what a test injection is. So MRI and CT injectors have that function. Only used on CT injector. That's not true. MRI injectors do it as well. Performed with the operator at the patient's bedside. Once the test injection is complete, then the operator. Because once this line right here, you guys see this first phase, and then it's blue, and then there's a white line that goes underneath it. That's a hold. That indicates a hold. So as soon as the test injection's over, the system automatically goes into hold. Because if I'm going to do a test injection, I'm going to do it at the patient's bedside. As soon as I see that we're good, then the operator leaves. They go back into the control room, and then they come to the display, and then they continue with the injection from there. All right. which one are we at? The enable button, that's this button right here. The enable button, as you guys can see, you can manually move these pistons forward and reverse with these forward and reverse arrow keys here. But for safety reasons, because if we're connected to the patient here, these buttons don't work until I hit the enable button. Now they work. Because we don't want somebody to grab the injector head and move it and accidentally move the pistons while we're connected to the patient. So we have to hit the enable button to make that happen, and it goes out after about 5 seconds, and then we're good to go again. So that's the enable button. The forward and reverse load buttons you saw, that's what these are here. Pretty much every injector has these multi-speed forward and reverse buttons. And then well, I shouldn't say every injector. There's one dumb injector that doesn't have these manual knobs. All right, you're literally just manually moving the piston forward and reverse.